Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. As we've been talking to lawyer and paralegal venture candidates of late. Again, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trias College, or any other education institution or organization that I'm affiliated with. Today, continuing our paralegal venture series, we have Vladimir joining us. So, Vladimir, first of all, thanks for taking the time to speak with me. Perhaps we can get started. You can tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, John Paul. It's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be here and to speaking to my fellow paralegals, colleagues as a venture candidate. As my background goes back to 1991 when I came to this country as a refugee, and I started at an immigration and refugee law firm almost immediately as I arrived in Canada, and I was a translator. And then I progressed. By about 1992, I progressed to a role of a paralegal, and I was an immigration paralegal, dealing with immigration and refugee matters and helping my community, which is a Jewish Russian-speaking community. And at that point, I started taking on further roles and started going to court on criminal matters and odd small claims. I then went on my own at about 1994, not about exactly 1994. I started my own practice as a paralegal independently, and I ran that for about 10 years. I think that my last immigration application was completed in 2005, and I was still doing odd court appearances and resolution meetings and simple guilty pleas in summary criminal matters until about 2005, when I became a licensed real estate agent. And so when an opportunity came up to be grandfathered, I was about on the cusp of 2008, 2009. I was already starting my own brokerage company. So I decided I really couldn't care for another regulator. So I passed on that opportunity. And then as I continued to work in the same community, essentially, and all my contacts from 13, 14 years of working in the legal field, as they continued to contact me and, hey, Vladimir, can you recommend somebody to deal with this small claims matter? And then it was paralegals already became licensed, and then I couldn't help them anymore. And at one point, I decided that I needed to go back and get my education. And the reality is, really, it was my very first career in Canada. It was my first love in that sense. And I've ventured into other careers. I was for a little bit, I was a disability insurance claims investigator. I was investigating life and disability claims. And I have background in human biology and abnormal psychology and neuroscience. And I had a very unique role. I was investigating disability claims related to mental health. And because it's a very, very unique niche, there was very, very few people in Canada who actually did exactly what I did. I got to be contracted to travel all across Canada for those disability claims. That was very interesting. I traveled everywhere from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC, and some of the remote parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And then I didn't really enjoy some of the aspects of defense work, if you know what I mean, in the insurance industry. Some of it really didn't agree with me. And I decided to do other things. But then at the same time, I always kept my heart and my mind on legal work. And finally, I went back, made it full circle, came back to the paralegal profession through the same channels as all the new licensee, which means I had to pay the full ticket price for it. I couldn't be grandfathered anymore. And then I came back to the profession again through college and the LSO exam, and here I am.
Now, Vladimir, I guess going from there, I mean, as much as you draw roots, as you said, 30 plus years in 30 plus years ago, right, when you first sort of started doing paralegal work, as again, you didn't have to be licensed or anything there, but now you come forth, a few years after becoming licensed through the new process here, and you want to put your name forward as bencher. So why are you deciding to run here in the 2023 elections?
Well, there really are multiple reasons. The two main reasons is because I'm in a very unique position to identify and kind of take a bird's eye view on how the profession developed. Because I was part of the profession in the very exciting years of the 90s, when it was just after the very exciting Supreme Court of Canada case featuring points. And we were allowed to go to court, and they took us seriously, and we were allowed to speak in court. And I, of course, my work in the community, immigration work. And it took a lot of commitment to be a paralegal in the 90s, because you had to self-educate. College programs were not available. If you wanted to survive in the business, you needed to continue to educate yourself. I went in immigration law. I went to all of the Bar Association resources and seminars that the immigration bar was offering at that time. They had 2-day conferences and updates on immigration law, costly, no special discounts for paralegals, immigration consultants, or general public. You had to pay admission price just as lawyers. And I went there, and I saw a lot of my colleagues there as well. But coming back to the more recent years, as I came into the paralegal professions through the college stream, and looking at both histories, both timelines, so to speak, I can't help it but identify a lot of things that I think that we can improve as far as governance of the legal profession and paralegal, or legal profession, both legal professions in general, in public interest. And I think that I am uniquely suited to contribute to that, as I come not only from these two timelines of being a paralegal, but also my very diverse other business experiences, experiences in real estate, experiences in investigative work, other education that I bring to the table, other insights that I bring to the table, and cultural competence that I bring to the table, which I believe is extremely important. And another reason, which is very strong for me for throwing my hat in the ring, is because I would really like to stand against conformity in governance of legal profession. I see coalition politics as a threat. Anyone who's watched any of my videos, or at least some of them, or follow me on social media, you know where I stand on the issue. An argument has been made by the Coalition for Good Governance that you must necessarily vote for all of those people that are 40 lawyers and 5 paralegals. And the argument has been made that it's necessary to vote for all of them as a matter of survival of the legal profession. And otherwise the profession is facing a threat of ending self-regulation. I think it is a very selfish and entitled, self-glorifying argument that has nothing to do with reality. I think the opposite is true. I think it is the coalition politics that is a threat to the profession. And I think it is incumbent on the voter to recognize that it's not the team that's asking you to be elected together that is the savior, but it is the independence of governance. It is the independence of the bench, independence of each of the governors in convocation. That is the way to save the legal profession from ending self-regulation. And here I am.
All right, so let's get into all of that. I mean, in terms of the issues here, and I know you had a number of videos, so perhaps maybe you can kind of summarize some of the important issues there. I know we'll get into coalition politics and everything in a second. But besides that, I mean, what you displayed all these videos on your website and other areas. Perhaps you can kind of summarize those issues by maybe summarizing some of the videos you had, and we can go from there.
So I build my platform on 3 pillars, essentially. One is access to competence and what has to do with expansion of scope. And everybody wants to talk about expansion of scope. I haven't seen one paralegal candidate who has not talked about expansion of paralegal scope. Everyone approaches it from different angles. Everyone brings something new to the conversation. I bring my perspective, and we can talk about that if you wish. The second is responsible and efficient governance. I don't know if anyone should be even allowed to use the trademark on good governance. I mean, what in the world does the word good mean anyway? But responsible and efficient governance includes a number of things. It includes responsible operation of administration of justice within our own self-regulation. I have identified a number of concerns that, without the necessary transparency, cause me, some questions that I would like to address. I'd like to bring to light, and I'd like to see how we can solve that. Responsible and efficient governance also stands for something I haven't yet addressed in my videos, and I don't know if I should. It's kind of self-evident that we do not have equitable representation as paralegals in convocation. There's, as you know, 40 lawyers, 8 lay benchers, and only 5 paralegals. I don't know where that magic number came from. It was initially 2, actually. Well, initially it was none, but then it was 2, and then it went to 5. And I think it's high time that it becomes a higher proportion, at least proportionate representations of paralegals to lawyers, which if you do the math, it's anywhere between 7 and 8. But I think for an equitable representation, it should be at the minimum equal to the number of lay benchers. And fiscal policies, balancing fiscal responsibility with fiscal equity.
All right, so I don't know if you had another issue there, but all right, so let's start with scope there, because everyone wants to talk about scope. And as you point out, everyone has different theories on how to go about implementing it. One, of course, I mean, as you pointed out just there in the last sentence, you need to get it through convocation, where there's 40 lawyers and 8 lay benchers, and even amongst the paralegal benchers, who's to say that there's uniformity there, right? So in terms of what areas you can highlight in terms of where you'd see scope perhaps being expanded, but also what's the sort of process, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, we need immigration, we need family, we need this, we need that, but how are you going to get that and convince the powers to be, the rest of the board, right, to get 27 or 26 other voices to say, yes, I'm in agreement with this, because otherwise it's just a dream and it can't become reality. So perhaps maybe you can expand on both of those points.
I think a lot of my colleagues, unfortunately, have taken the line that expansion of scope is a matter of competition. And I have said early on in my campaign and in one of the videos that decisions taken by benchers in convocation should never be informed by self-interest and competition. And I think that self-interest and competition pervaded convocation decisions on scope since the beginning of paralegal regulation. We have only seen this very minuscule expansion of scope into family law for the first time in 15 years. I think that it's a big challenge. And I think the way to solve it is through, first of all, there's a lot of interest that needs to be on board. So there's a little bit of a shuttle diplomacy that needs to happen in order for it to happen. It's not just a push for interests of paralegals or for paralegal rights, as some of my colleague bencher candidates have put it. It's essentially, you have to present a plan of how this is going to address the issue of access to justice in public interest. Let's talk about immigration for a minute. Everybody wants to talk about immigration. I might as well start there. There is a genuine need and demand in communities of new Canadians, ethnic communities, and immigrant communities for competent and affordable services in immigration and refugee law. Paralegals are capable of providing those services. I think that the work has to be done in convocation. I commend my my fellow candidates or my colleagues who have taken the initiative of taking the Law Society to task and started legal action against the Law Society. I think that it's one way of addressing the issue, and not a bad one. The courts may have something to say, but it's not the only one. I think, as I mentioned, there's got to be a little bit of a shuttle diplomacy and the work that has to be done between the benchers and see the impact that persuasion can make on personal level to convince more and more lawyers to come on the side when they see the importance of opening that area of scope for us. I personally see that it flies in the face of access to justice and public interest for Law Society to be actively blocking paralegals from providing immigration services. I think when there is a legal challenge happening, just like with the Metrolinx challenge, at one point, the convocation will have to make a decision whether to defend it or not. And I hope to be one of the voices on the inside that says, no, we can't defend it. It's embarrassing to even try and defend an application that's so strongly on its face shows that the Law Society is blocking paralegals from doing something that is in the interest of the public. As far as the family law is concerned, again, one has to be, I believe that there is room to revisit that proposal, the FLSP. It would be interesting to see if what the composition of the new convocation is going to be, and again, to see who the lawyers are, who the players are, and what their thoughts are. From that perspective, the FOLA survey has been very interesting to me because you get to see, which one I'm talking about. You get to see lawyers have expressed their opinions as to whether paralegals can expand their scope. And unfortunately, you see some lawyers that have said no. If we come back to the coalition politics, you have seen lawyers such as Professor Alford, who said he doesn't want to expand paralegal scope on the Slate side. You also see Quinn Ross on the coalition side, who says that he would like the paralegal scope to be reduced back to the December 1st status. So you do see, as much as they have shown some conformity on a variety of other issues, the lawyers are kind of all over the place as far as the scope is concerned. So it will really depend on who gets selected and then how you work with them. So far, my work has been, I have gone into convocation records. I have gone into motion records and votes. I researched who the players are, who those benchers are, and how they vote, and little blocks that apparent that they formed together. And you can see if you research through the voting records on different motions, at least through the last years, you can see that several benchers stick together on some issues. And as a matter of fact, there's that nucleus that formed the Good Governance Coalition. I think it's like 10, 11, and 12 benchers. They stuck together and they voted together on a number of different issues. So it really depends on those factors a lot. What I bring to the table is my ability to be persuasive, my ability to be researched, my ability to negotiate and find a win-win situation between the different sides. After all, I have good sales background, and I train other people on closing and negotiation, and I hope to bring that.
So Vladimir, I guess it comes then to this point, right? Because I mean, on the other benchers, again, I can't put myself, it's like in cross-examination, you can't guess what they're thinking. But I mean, the counterpoint always that comes up to scope, from maybe the lawyer bencher perspective is there the competence there, right? I mean, I know some of the people I've talked to here on the paralegal side, at least, are saying, well, I can switch from, you mentioned doing, immigration work. As a lawyer, I could go from practicing in immigration law, and then tomorrow I want to do wills and estates, and the rules of professional conduct being the only thing that kinds of guides me to make that decision. I can get hired. Someone can offer me a job in a different area, and I can do it. Right now, for paralegals, the same thing. Right, you mentioned points. Right, so maybe points offers a job in POA, and you were previously doing only small claims. You can move from small claims over to POA and work with I think Shalina or whoever, right? And you are able to do that. But if you want to now go into immigration, let's say, and it opens up to you, there's a pause of, is there a transition that's needed? Is there maybe, like for family law, hours of education you need to do? Is there CPDs you need to do? Is there experience you need to show? Right. So again, and this ties back into opening or expanding or reducing scope, as you referenced that FOLA survey, because from a lawyer's perspective, they might say, well, I went to 4 years of school, I went to 3 years of law school, I did articling, I worked in these areas. And if we're going to just say someone who may not even study that in school, possibly depending on where they went, they didn't get tested on it on a licensing exam, and now they're going to be able to do it. And there's also, I don't want to forget, there's immigration consultants in the picture as well, whether they're also paralegals or not. And there's a program at Queens that they can go through for a year for that pathway. So, all of these players looking at it, and again, just on immigration, but you can apply this for family or divisional court or any other expansion. And that's sort of the pause that's going to come from the other side. So how would you respond in terms of, a transition that needs to be done, if anything, to present that convocation of, here's why we should expand the scope, and here's how to alleviate those concerns that seem to come up and have maybe led to erosion of, FLSP, for example, the last time?
Well, let's make a distinction between competence and competencies. And I think that distinction is very familiar to you because you teach, right? Competence is something, as you mentioned, is subject to our rules of paralegal rules of conduct, or rules of professional conduct for lawyers. We are required to be competent. If I have competence in matters of small claims court, and I've done only that for years and years and years, I may not have competence to immediately switch and become effective for my clients in POA courts. I may need to bring myself up to date. And lawyers are able to exercise their informed discretion on how they follow the rules of professional conduct. Why do paralegals need the babysitting? If lawyers are trusted to decide for themselves, hey, I have these professional rules of professional conduct. I cannot just start going to Supreme Court of Canada arguing constitutional law all of a sudden, if all I've done ever was wills in the States. And I believe no lawyer will ever want to do that. Why are we not in a position to trust that a paralegal will also not exercise that same informed discretion as it relates to our rules of paralegal conduct? Why do paralegals need special babysitting or special licenses to go from one area to the next? Let me give you an example. Somebody mentioned right rightly so, that there is more tribunals in Ontario than perhaps in any other jurisdiction. Our competence is presumed going into many of these tribunals. Nuclear Energy Tribunal. How many paralegals practice there? Probably none. How many paralegals provide legal services before the Ontario Land Tribunal? Probably very few. How many colleges provide any education at all in planning law, environmental law, heritage, municipal law? Probably none. Yet our competence is presumed at these tribunals, subject to our adherence to the rules of paralegal conduct and subject to our own informed discretion on how we must educate ourselves and bring ourselves up to speed on those areas of substantive law. Let's talk about competencies. Competencies is something that the Law Society regulates, the standards of education and the standards of professional competence, and is regulated through competencies that the Law Society as a regulator establishes that we must achieve through our education programs. We're talking about competencies in writing, legal research, advocacy, understanding foundational aspects of our legal system, courts and tribunals, how evidence works, and those competencies absolutely need to be strengthened. And I don't think the Paralegal Standing Committee has made enough of a change by simply acquiescing to the fact that, oh, there's already almost every college already exceeding the mandatory instructional hours for courts and tribunals, 30 hours here and 40 hours there, and they've raised it by another 10 hours. I don't think that helps. And I think that if we wanted to address expansion of scope, and I did talk about it in at least one of my videos, we need to take a more holistic approach at the problem. We need to first strengthen the foundational competencies that are taught at pre-licensing level. But we have been grandfathered before. Well, I haven't. I passed on that opportunity, but a lot of my colleagues in the profession have, and they have been trusted, given the competence or given the competencies that they have, to bring themselves up on a level of competence in the particular substantive area in which they practice. So, do we necessarily need to go to school? Who wants to go to school for 6 months or 4 months to study the family law, to only be able to do something within this very, very limited scope that has been allowed to us? And essentially, I believe it was like 260 hours, which is 260 hours more than lawyers ever had to be able to do family law. And I understand I understand the programs that lawyers take. I understand how much more is taught in law school by way of competencies that are necessary for that type of work. But if we are already trusted to be legal professionals, licensed professionals, we have we are responsible. We have the mechanism to enforce our duty of competence. I don't see any reason why paralegals need the additional licensing scheme and babysitting to go to different practice areas. Not only is it discouraging and deterring for paralegals, it is also inefficient from governance perspective. Now the Law Society has to regulate several professions, the lawyers, the paralegals, the FLSPs, and now that the precedent is set, potentially other different licenses or different professions that come with every next expansion of scope. I think that's not efficient. I think that's not responsible governance, and I would like to have that revisited.
But isn't that contradictory? Because on one hand, you're saying, look, the competencies in colleges need to be, now again, let's assume, no, you're right here. I mean, without getting into it, but they need to be strengthened because this, and this is deficient. But those individuals who've already gone through college and may have gone through those deficiencies, they don't need anything further, just like lawyers, in terms of moving to this, whatever area that's new scope, right? So, I mean, for those who are already licensed and you're acknowledging that perhaps there were some deficiencies in the competencies in their education, you're saying they don't need to do anything further. But for those who are going to go to school in the future, they need to go further in terms of education that they get. So how do you kind of reconcile those 2 points?
I think that expansion of areas in not only in law, also technology and medicine is inevitable. And there is always going to be expansion, no matter what area, what industry you're in. And the way I reconcile it is, yes, these professionals are already out there. We are already out there. We are already licensed. We recognize our responsibilities. We know that we need more if we want to get into this area. We should be trusted as officers of the court, as legal professionals who have mechanisms of enforcing our duty of competence by the law society, who are subject to those mechanisms. We should be trusted to exercise our own informed discretion in bringing ourselves up to speed. I don't see any conflict with respect to what I said. Yes, the new generation of paralegals can benefit from better education. There's no question about it. And tools need to be created for paralegals of the existing generation to be able to catch up to speed.
Okay, so now I want to move on, obviously, to Slate's coalitions there. You brought it up already. And part of this, I mean, sort of goes part and parcel here with this previous point, because ultimately you're going to need support, with whatever you present from lawyer benchers in the future. Right now, I mean, on one hand, you brought up, well, look, these 10 people voted together and you looked at some records. But again, first of all, there's now 45 candidates on the Good Governance Coalition running, and 35 on the Full Stop team. There are members of both teams that were incumbent benchers. There are a lot more members, especially on the paralegal side, where you have 4 out of 5 have never stepped foot in convocation, right? So don't you think painting a picture of, well, this is the nucleus, these 10 people, they all voted together, therefore these 45, if they're voted in, or whoever, whatever combination, well, then they're going to also vote the same way based on these 10 people that I've looked at, and again, according to you, these records of votes that had happened. So kind of how do you sort of paint everyone with that brush if they're wearing the Good Governance Coalition colors, and to a lesser extent the Full Stop, because there's no Full Stop candidates running for paralegal bencher, but how do you kind of paint them all the same way, that they're going to vote the same way, that's going to be conforming and so forth?
First of all, I'm not painting anybody by the same brush. I recognize that everybody is an individual and everybody has their own understanding of what the interests of the public are, or their own core values that they bring to the table, and their own experience and their backgrounds and their own competence in governance. I do recognize that. Where I object is to the fact that, so this was this core, this nucleus, as we said, and then this nucleus had gone out to specifically recruit the like-minded individuals to join them in opposing another coalition or a slate or another group, another faction, another formation of like-minded individuals, if you will. And what is happening right now is, instead of, for 225 years, John Paul, you agree with me that the Law Society has been able to avoid one of the worst political plagues in any liberal democracy, the partisan dictatorship of the majority. It has, partisanship has been political reality since time immemorial, and it has obvious pros and cons, maybe benefits in governing a state. But a corporation which is created in the public interest is supposed to look after the interest of the entire society, not the interest of the majority that a winning party represents. And where these coalitions have formed, or slates of coalitions where they have formed themselves, is they have formed themselves ideologically. They have formed themselves on shared group values. You have to necessarily subscribe to the shared group values of the coalition in order to be accepted as a member of that exclusive team. And that to me signals conformity. First of all, I'm not even debating whether there is a whip or not. Everybody says there is no whip. Okay, there's no whip. I'm prepared to trust that there is no whip. But hasn't it already been sort of pre-whipped by recruiting like-minded people who already signed off on a very comprehensive set of shared values and shared principles? And wouldn't every decision taken by these people have to be cross-referenced again against this set of shared values and principles that they have agreed to adopt as a condition of being accepted on that team? And I'm not singling out one coalition or another. I'm speaking in general. And I think that's where the danger is for self-regulation. Because once again, I think it's more efficient to self-regulate. Look at municipalities. Same thing happens to municipalities. As soon as partisanship starts pervading municipal governments, things get out of control. And then Ford government has to step in and reduce the number of city councilors. What happens if Ford government steps in right now and says, no, you guys can't self-regulate. We're going to reduce the number of lawyer benchers. We're going to increase the number of lay benchers. And by the way, can they do this in the middle of this election? Just like they did in the middle of the Toronto municipal election? Of course they can. And 3 years and a few $1 million later, a decision comes back from the Supreme Court of Canada that says, yeah, Ford government can do it. And when the public is looking at that, and it has the appearance that what's going on here? What kind of mob wars are happening here? This is not how we want the lawyers to behave. Is it possible that the public can lose faith and confidence in the integrity of self-regulation? I think it is. I don't know, but I think it's quite possible that at any given moment, a political party may run on a premise that the public is losing confidence in self-regulation of lawyers, and then they will step in and regulate us by way of a crown agency, just like it happened in many jurisdictions. And interestingly enough, it's the coalition that brings that argument, which I find very self-serving. They bring up this argument that, look what happened in other jurisdictions, Australia and England. And by the way, it didn't only happen to lawyers. Crown Agency just stepped in to regulate real estate agents in British Columbia. Denturists, I believe, lost their self-regulation. There's a number of professions that are losing self-regulation, the privilege of self-regulation for those reasons. I think the argument that you must elect this single party in order to preserve self-regulation is entirely self-serving. I think that in order to preserve self-regulation, we need to preserve the independence, the camaraderie, sound judgment of people who are governors, who are elected governors of this profession.
Okay, so Vladimir, in response to that, I mean, certainly the members of the Good Governance Coalition that I talked to, again, maybe loosely paraphrasing from their interviews, but essentially the only thing worse than two parties is one party. And if you don't come together, again, let's accept this is their position, right? Is that there was vote splitting, and the full stop group would be elected, all 35 of them, and the independents wouldn't have a chance because you're divided amongst them, right? And then their premise is once elected, if elected, right, is that we're going to vote independently, right? And you've even pointed it out, looking at the FOLA responses, that there's no consistency in terms of, on that issue of should paralegals have expanded or reduced similar scope, right? So again, is this the same thing as saying, well, it's a two-party system, if after the election, if, again, the Good Governance group ends up being elected, or a number of them being elected, that they vote however they wish to? Is that any different than, let's say, two independent candidates? Let's say yourself and I don't know, Sean are aligned every vote because you respect each other or something after the fact, even though you run as a party. Is that any different than how you got there? What happens vote wise or discussion wise in the public interest? Whoever ends up being a venture candidate.
Well, I think there's a couple of questions in your comment that's worth addressing. So, number one, this argument from the coalition that it's a necessary evil, if I understand it correctly, right? Now we have this one coalition, that one slate, that they there's an allegation that they vote as a bloc, which, by the way, isn't entirely factually accurate according to my research. I've actually gone in and compared votes, and you've seen that in one of the groups that I posted. There's actually the opposite seems to be true. It's the nucleus that created the Coalition for Good Governance that seems to be voting together on many issues more than the slate lawyers have voted together. But aside from that, so let's deal with the argument that it's a necessary evil. What does it say about the integrity of someone who goes against this method using the exact same method that they stand against? If I stand against splitting votes, how is it good governance? How is it okay for me to use the method of splitting votes in order to achieve the objective of ending the vote splitting? Honest to God, I have never seen a politician so openly speaking from both sides of their mouths. So that goes to that. Now, let's also, speaking on that also subject, the clash between the Full Stop and the coalition began with the EDI issue. And you remember the infamous, or the statement of principles. So that was dealt with, okay. But the core of EDI is diversity inclusion, equitable access to governance. Diversity is not about how wonderfully multicolored or multicultural or multigendered the governing board looks. I'll give them that. They look very multicultural and very diverse. The question is, how diverse and equitable are they able to function? And it goes to the core of my point that anytime you form an exclusive club, you're fundamentally anti-inclusive. How can a member of the coalition possibly support diversity candidates that even represent or share their own identity when they are now under an obligation to promote votes for their coalition? I think that's fundamentally inequitable, that denies that approach to governance, denies access to governance to individuals from diverse backgrounds, from diverse communities, and from varied perspectives and insights. Because everybody is now operating under an obligation, a mutual obligation, to seek votes for the entire team. So I can't even, if I was a member of the coalition, I couldn't try and help the diversity of, bring the diversity to convocation by promoting access to governance, inclusive and equitable access to governance across various diversity groups, across a broad spectrum of identities. I'm not only talking about one particular line of diversity or one particular axis, like, the line. I'm not talking about just racial or cultural. I'm also talking about, health is important. Varied perspective and backgrounds are very important in convocation. They inform decision-making they enrich decision-making, they enrich debate. It is important. But how can it be possible when every member is seeking votes for the entire group and they bring ideological conformity into convocation based on a predefined set of shared values and principles that they have agreed to adopt as a condition on being on that team. So that's that. Remind me.
Well, I guess
The
the point is this, it's the second point here, right? Is okay, however they come about, right? If they're running together, running individually, you then show up at convocation, right? There's going to be benchers ultimately on both the paralegal and lawyer side that are going to be, maybe affiliated with Full Stop, with the Good Governance, Independent, and that, as the Good Governance Coalition pledges, right, is that vote. However, the only thing that they're going to look at is electoral reform. But again, even your own information there about paralegal scope, they have different viewpoints, right? So, I mean, yes, they're relying on each other to get support to get voted in, but once voted in, the ideologies differ according, again, just on that one point. I mean, we can look at other ones, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have the pendulum necessarily swinging all the way to the left, saying, okay, well, now they're going to push in maybe all these EDI initiatives, because that's what they pledged to as the Good Governance Coalition. It's just, at this point, we use the support of each other to get elected. Now we're free to vote accordingly, however we feel, just like any other independent candidate will look at issues and say, I agree, I disagree. And I admit, certainly, and they admit to themselves that, there's a leap of faith needed to connect, the vote to then how are they going to govern? Again, supposed to be in the public interest, but does it matter if they're running together? What happens after they're elected, if they're elected, in terms of these issues and their votes?
I think you're absolutely right. It requires a leap of faith, because even though they pledge not to vote together when elected, they are certainly operating in the manner that is substantially equivalent to a political party in order to get elected. And how do you avoid the appearance of implicit loyalty to a group that just helped you get elected? Right? And I'm even more concerned about paralegals who have been recruited to be on the Good Governance Coalition. At least there are no paralegals that, the Full Stop is dragging into that rabbit hole. But the paralegals who are with the Good Governance Coalition, they are campaigning together, they're sharing resources, they are campaigning for each other. They're planning their campaign events, or not campaign events. I haven't seen any, to be honest, but they're planning their campaign and together, and they're coordinating their efforts together. They are working together as a team. It doesn't matter if you call it a party, a political party, not a political party, you call it any kind of faction, a team. They are going through an active and intentional process of training themselves that there is no I in the team. Yes, it requires a tremendous leap of faith for a voter to believe that they will be able to undo that and get back to becoming independent voters after they have bound together over the election issues during this election period. And I don't even think they realize when they come out and they actually tell that as a good thing to the voter, that we already started building relationship with lawyers. Listen, it may be a good thing. It may not necessarily be a good thing. But when you are building relationship with lawyers, when you're building team relationships and faction relationships, even though you are telling us that you intend not to vote under a whip, which there's whip or no whip, it doesn't matter. You are going through the process of forming a faction. It's an active and intentional process of building yourself as a team. And so at the minimum, the voter will have to reconcile that there will be a conflict between their own ideas on what interests of the public are and what an influential coalition leader might tell them in a given moment, what the interests of the public should be. And how do you resist that? other than by convincing yourself that, hey, you know what? Those are my, let me think that those are my ideas and I'm going to vote on them. I mean, it's a conflict, right? You know, the legal maxim, justice should not only be served, but should also be seen to be served, should also be seen to be done, right? I think the same applies to governance. They should be seen without conflict. They should be seen without any apprehension of loyalty. And I don't think they can avoid the apprehension of loyalty, even if in their mind, loyalty isn't even there. And I think it's a disadvantage. I think, to be honest with you, listen, I have never, nor will I ever, engaged with another bencher candidate in a manner that is disparaging or defamatory or called them out personally. I disagree with some of them on policy. I agree with some of them on policy. What I've seen, going on in the social media scheme is repugnant. I will never engage with another candidate in that way. But I do believe that a lot of my colleagues who are bencher candidates on both sides, the coalition, there's two paralegal coalitions. I believe that they would have stood much brighter. They would make a greater impact if they haven't tainted their image with the appearance of implicit loyalty that the coalition, that shadow that coalition throws on them. I believe that some of the coalition candidates that I would personally love to support, I think that they would stand much better on their own 2 feet and run on their own 2 feet than having the having the appearance of special interests carrying them to victory.
Well, I mean, I just
fundamental to the integrity of self-governance.
So I wanted to say one point on that. I mean, how is that any different than, again, the whole concept of this election? You have lawyers voting for lawyers, and then those who are elected have to serve in the public interest, and then paralegals electing paralegals, and then again serving in the public interest, because, I mean, you're going to have that same issue of loyalty to whoever votes for you, right? If so-and-so comes out and says, hey, I support Vladimir, and then you get elected and they're like, hey, you remember I helped you get elected and I really want this immigration issue or something else. I mean, isn't there inherently loyalty to whoever elects you? Meanwhile, you have a duty to govern in the public interest, right? I mean, whether you're running as part of a coalition or independently, right? I mean, isn't that live in any election here where you're voted by one people, but you're supposed to govern in the interest of the public who don't vote for you?
Do we not distinguish, do we not see the difference between my voter or my pool of voters who elect me to govern the profession in public interest and a pool of candidates who ask the voter to elect me to be in the coalition together? I think that's a crucial distinction to answer your question. And I think that distinction answers the question where I do not owe loyalty to my voter. I am responsible, I am accountable to my voter who elected me to govern the profession in public interest. Do I want to be responsible and accountable to another bencher for helping me get elected? I think that would be absolutely detrimental to the integrity of self-governance. And that, I hope that answers your question.
All right, so let's switch gears for the last few minutes here, because I know I saw, in terms of you mentioned social media, again, we touched on it a little bit. You're relatively new in terms of being licensed as a paralegal. You mentioned certainly issues with education. You talked about brain drain and that some paralegals want to go on and become lawyers. I think, yourself, you're even going through that process to my understanding. But then, how do you do all these things? And then are you looking at it from the perspective of, if you're a licensed paralegal, do you really have the licensed paralegals back, as I kind of understand sort of the comments there? And I wanted to give you, I know you said you would give them a response, so I want you to come straight, from the horse's mouth, as it says, to respond to that. I mean, do you need to have experience in order to be, a bencher candidate? Is it okay if you have other interests? How would you respond to that kind of comment that was brought out, I think yesterday or the day before?
Can you identify that comment a little bit better so I know what I'm responding to? Because I think there was a number of comments made, and I have a couple of responses owing to that group.
Yeah, I think it was essentially that, again, you have this real estate practice, and you have, again, you may be going and becoming a lawyer. And how do you want, and you've only been licensed for a few years, how are you going to advocate, on the paralegal side if you have all of these other things in mind?
Okay, so there are three distinct points and there are three distinct concerns that were expressed in the social media that you saw yesterday. And one is, how am I going to do this if I'm somebody says that they have the understanding that I'm going to become a lawyer? Well, first of all, I have never made it a secret that I attend that I'm enrolled in an LLB program by distance learning. You know perfectly well that there's a difference between LLB, which is an undergraduate law degree, and L1 licensing process. Not every LLB is even eligible for L1 licensing. Let me walk you through this a little bit and let me address this with our viewers. If you complete undergraduate law degree in Canada or in Ontario, anywhere in Canada, then you are eligible for L1 licensing process. If you are a foreign educated or a foreign law graduate, which is what I'm doing, I'm going through, I'm obtaining a law degree by distance learning outside of Canada. And once I obtain that law degree, that doesn't put me anywhere near L1 licensing application. As a matter of fact, in order for me to even be considered for L1 licensing application, if I wanted to, I would have to go through a very expensive and involved process of accreditation. Foreign lawyers, such as, like, if you come from a common law jurisdiction like India and Pakistan, I think South Africa, Jamaica, if you come from one of those, great, UK, oh no, England and Wales, let's say, if you come from those jurisdictions that are common law jurisdictions, it's an easier process for you to go through the accreditation. All you have to do is pass, I think 5, in some cases, they will assess 7 or 8 exams to then be eligible to write your bar. Okay, not distance learning. Distance learning isn't eligible for that stream. So let's say, well, let me start by this. I have given paralegal community my word and my commitment that once elected, I will serve as a bencher and I will serve as a paralegal bencher, and I will absolutely serve my term as elected. Not only that, I'm also interested in continuity. Even if I go through the accreditation process, let me put those concerns to rest. Even if I do, and I go through a $60,000 2-year LLM program, which is what a foreign distance learning graduate would have to do in order to become, in order to receive accreditation here. Even if I do that, the earliest that I could possibly get that done, and the earliest, without taking you through the math, let me just give you the summary. The earliest, based on where I am in my LLB program right now, that the earliest that I could get called to the bar, we're looking at the spring or even fall of 2027. So even if my good word wasn't enough for you, you know that I am physically unable to be called to the bar until at least after the end of my bencher term. But I assure you that I'm also interested in continuity. And I'm going to answer your second concern to back that up as well. But when the time comes, when it's 2027, even if I pass all the accreditation stages and ready to become a lawyer, even in that case, which I'm not committed to doing, but even if, I would rather run for re-election and continue building my legacy as a bencher of the Law Society of Ontario than become a fresh new coal, a fresh new lawyer at the age of 58. I hope that sounds convincing. Now, as far as, oh, by the way, did you know that paralegal can actually also be a treasurer? I don't think we have ever had a paralegal treasurer at the Law Society, but I would think that it's a worthwhile ambition to have. And I would think that a law degree might help. Now, there are obvious benefits having a law degree when you're a paralegal bencher. It's easier for you to build bridges with other lawyers. It's easier for you to establish yourself on equal footing, at least by way of education. And I think it would be great to have a law degree. It would be obvious benefit. It would be a great asset for a paralegal profession and for the public to have a paralegal bencher with a law degree in convocation. Conversely, let me suggest this. I find it very odd, very strange how the coalition of paralegals, or the Good Governance paralegal faction of the Good Governance Coalition, I'm not sure how to call it, but they have made the most strange and unnecessary pledge that I have ever seen from any aspiring leader, which is their collective vow of self-limitation, their collective vow of avoiding obtaining higher legal education that they have imposed upon each other. I'm referring to the Coalition Paralegals pledge not to apply or attend to law school. And I mean, I'm proud of my legal education. I have learned so much. I believe it's going to make me a better paralegal. I believe it's going to make me a better bencher. And I can't help it but ask, is less educated paralegal better for good governance than a paralegal who would dare to obtain a law degree? Let me go to your next question. I have become a real estate agent in 2005. When I made a decision to go back to paralegal profession, I made a decision to return to my, what I said was first love in that sense, my very first career in Canada, something that I always gravitated to. While being a real estate broker owner, I took the time to go back to college, almost never missed a class. I graduated with a spectacular average. With academic distinction, I graduated top of my class, passed the Law Society exam, and I proudly returned to the legal, to the justice sector, something what I always wanted to do, something where I always wanted to be. I run my brokerage together with my wife. She's a broker, she's a manager. She's been running it for the last, at least since the end of the pandemic. I'm a broker of record, which means I'm responsible for compliance. I'm responsible for my employees. I have 33 agents, 33 real estate agents on my team. Actually, today, we have recruited another agent that is transferring to the brokerage. So now I have 34 real estate agents on my team. I'm responsible for operating real estate commission trust account and real estate trust account for the last 15 years, with millions of dollars of other people's money flowing through them through these accounts annually. I don't know of another paralegal bencher candidate that has that on their resume. I don't know of another paralegal bencher candidate that has on their resume successfully operating a company of this size of licensed professionals in any industry without a single complaint, without a single regulatory complaint or any other blemish in its entire history. And I think it's an asset, and I think it's an additional background that I bring to the table. As a matter of fact, we talked about scope and how everybody likes to talk about immigration and family law. I am the only candidate that suggested this, and it's thanks to my background in real estate. How many times my colleagues and I have agonized in frustration over residential leases drafted by realtors? When we speak about expansion of scope, realtors are authorized to draft residential leases because of current legislation allows them. As a realtor, let me affirm to you that realtors do not have adequate mandatory training in drafting those leases. And I think it's self-evident to anyone who practices at the landlord and tenant board. Conversely, paralegals who litigate residential tenancies every day, who have in-depth, profound knowledge on current case law and LTB practices and procedures and the Residential Tenancies Act itself, are precluded from drafting residential leases by operation of bylaw 4. Where's common sense in that? I'm the only candidate that had brought forward that proposal as far as expansion of scope. And I believe we already have the competencies and the competence required in order to be authorized to draft residential leases. Not only that, authorizing paralegals to draft residential leases could have an immediate and palpable impact on access to justice across every community in Ontario. It would have an almost immediate reduction of processing times and costs of operation of the landlord and tenant board in this province. Not only that, the best part is the real estate legislation that licenses, the term is not licensing that, but you know what I mean, the real estate legislation governing real estate agents exempts from registration requirements professionals who trade in real estate for the sole purpose of arranging residential tenancies. That means if we get that expansion of scope through, paralegals could be earning commission from landlords.
All right, so Vladimir, last question here. I gotta jump in here, or two parts, as you probably know. And first of all, thank you for taking the time and answering all of these questions here over an hour, I guess we're at now. So last thing I wanted to ask, two parts there. First of all, for any of the students that are listening, any words of wisdom that you have for them. And then lastly, of course, for all the paralegals that are tuning in, and next month, or April 1st is tomorrow there, but in a couple of weeks, they'll be going to the polls. Why should they cast their vote for you, Vladimir?
What's the first question?
Advice for students who don't have a vote, that are listening as they get into the profession, as they move forward. Any words of wisdom for them? I mean, especially I think given your background, coming back to school at the age you did, I have a lot of students that are making a similar decision, and certainly they would appreciate any advice and words of wisdom in that regard.
Absolutely. Learn to use every tool that your education provider is giving you. When I was in college, I was so privileged and so happy that I had access to Quick Law, which now I have to pay big bucks for. Use that, play with it, do as much as possible with it. If you have that access provided to you, included in your fee from your education provider, learn how to do legal research. It is imperative no matter what you do, no matter what area, no matter what scope, no matter where you go, it is imperative for you to learn how to do how to do legal research. So learn that outside of your 40 hours or 30 hours of college mandatory instructional hours. Do that every time. Play with it every time, every day. That's number one. Number two, learn to work collaboratively. Go to observe tribunals, hearings. We have groups on social media that post links to Zoom. Go to courts, they're now open. Sit and watch trials. Absorb the legal lingo. Understand the decorum in the courtroom. Understand so that when you come to the courtroom, you can be confident when you speak before the court or before the tribunal. Do that in groups of 2 or 3. Do that collaboratively. Learn to work together. Learn to work in small groups and bounce ideas off of each other. Make friends. The first person you're going to call when you graduate is not me, and it's not John Paul, and it's not the paralegal bencher of the Law Society of Ontario. It's going to be one of your classmates. And that's my advice to paralegal students. Why should you vote for me? I think I have demonstrated that I run as one of the most prepared, dedicated, committed candidates in this election. Yes, I have not been around for a chunk of time. I was a paralegal in the 90s and early 2000s. I have come back to the profession recently, which seems like I haven't been licensed for a long time. I haven't been licensed for a long time. Doesn't mean I haven't been a paralegal for a long time. I actually have. And I have this view, I bring this diverse insights and my perspective to convocation of paralegals who have been operating in the 90s. I speak the language of those veterans. And I also understand the challenges that new licensees faced as I just recently went through that licensing process myself. I uniquely combine the ability to bring both of those insights to convocation. I bring a wealth of other backgrounds to convocation that I've given example of how convocation can benefit from my perspectives and my backgrounds to catch up, or I guess to make up for the loss that I've experienced in name recognition. I've put together a lot of work, and I have researched. Not only did I paint a wonderful vision of where I want the paralegal community to be, or where I want the profession to be, or how it needs to be governed, I have actually gone into, I've researched financial statements of the Law Society. I compared them year over year for the past, going back to 2011. I've researched annual reports of the Law Society and the subsidiary corporations. I've actually put in my time and effort to understand the structure of the corporation and the business of the board on which I run to serve as a director. And I have identified areas that need to be improved and that need to be looked at. And it's my research and preparation that informs my platform, not just, sharing a wonderful vision of, hey, we want scope. Everybody wants scope. Hey, we want to reduce our fees. Of course we do. But I also understand, and also having my executive and business background and experience, I understand what it's going to take for us to get to the point where we can actually bring equitable problems that are affordable and sustainable for us, which I expressed in my platform. And I think that I run as one of the most prepared candidates that is able to serve in this role on the board of governors of the Law Society of Ontario. I am committed. I have my brokerage is my source of income. I will never be in a position where I have to choose between putting in my hours as a bencher or feeding my family. I am financially stable. I'm in the best position of my life to put in my volunteer hours and my volunteer work. And the most honorable place where I would like to do that is serving my community, serving my profession, and governing my profession in the best interest of the public. And I have intentionally avoided the minute apprehension of loyalty or conflict to any other candidates by avoiding forming any blocs or coalitions with them. And you know that my vote will always be informed, and it will be independently informed. And that's why I ask you to vote for me. And I ask you to seriously consider voting for individuals, and not because one of them tells you to vote for everybody else.
Perfect. So Vladimir, thanks so much for taking all this time and answering all the questions there and sharing everything. For everyone that's tuning in, thanks again for tuning in as always, and take care and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.